In a 2014 study, researchers left people alone in an empty room for 15 minutes with nothing to do but think. No phone, no book, nothing on the walls worth looking at. The only other option available to them was a small device that delivered a mild electric shock to themselves, on purpose, if they pressed a button. A striking number of people, many of whom had said beforehand they'd pay money to avoid being shocked, pressed the button anyway, repeatedly, rather than just sit there with their own thoughts. The common assumption is that boredom is just empty time, passing a kind of personal failure to entertain yourself, or a small character flaw showing up whenever you're not disciplined or interesting enough to make good use of an idle moment. The instinct that follows from that assumption is almost always the same. Treat boredom as something to push through, ignore completely, or immediately smother the second it shows up, usually with whatever screen happens to be closest at hand. But if boredom were really just the simple absence of stimulation, sitting quietly with nothing to do for 15 minutes shouldn't feel urgent enough to make otherwise reasonable people shock themselves rather than just sit and endure it. The sheer intensity of that discomfort is itself the clue that something considerably more specific than nothing is currently happening is actually going on underneath it. The instinct that follows from that assumption is almost always the same. Treat boredom as something to push through, ignore completely, or immediately smother the second it shows up, usually with whatever screen happens to be closest at hand. But if boredom were really just the simple absence of stimulation, sitting quietly with nothing to do for 15 minutes shouldn't feel urgent enough to make otherwise reasonable people shock themselves rather than just sit and endure it. The sheer intensity of that discomfort is itself the clue that something considerably more specific than nothing is currently happening is actually going on underneath it. Psychologist John Eastwood and colleagues define boredom, quite precisely, as the uncomfortable experience of wanting to engage your attention with something satisfying and being genuinely unable to not simply low stimulation from the outside world, but a specific mismatch between what your attention actively wants and what it can currently find to latch onto. That precise framing matters a great deal because it treats boredom as an active, motivated state, not a passive absence. Researchers Bench and Lench go further still, proposing that boredom is a genuinely functional signal evolved specifically to redirect your attention and behavior away from an unsatisfying situation and toward something more rewarding elsewhere, structurally the same basic job that physical pain does for bodily harm. Pain tells you urgently to stop touching the hot stove. Boredom tells you the current activity, or the current lack of any activity at all, simply isn't worth your attention anymore, and that it's time to actively look elsewhere for something that is. That 2014 study wasn't really testing whether people simply dislike sitting still for a while. It was demonstrating just how strong the pull to escape unstructured, unengaged time can genuinely be strong enough for a meaningful number of people to override a clearly stated preference to avoid physical pain entirely, only minutes earlier. Being understimulated isn't a neutral state to your brain, sitting quietly in the background. It registers, apparently, as something actively worth escaping. This isn't a case for treating every single flicker of boredom as sacred and acting on it instantly, the moment it appears. People who are chronically, persistently boredom-prone across their whole lives tend to show poorer self-regulation overall, and measurably higher rates of impulsive or even genuinely risky behavior. So the underlying signal being real doesn't make it a free pass to act on every single time. The honest reframe isn't, boredom is always good, follow it blindly. It's boredom is useful information, not a personal flaw, and that distinction changes what you actually do with it in the moment. Boredom isn't a personal failing you need to muscle through, push down, or quietly apologize for. It's a functional signal, doing structurally the same job hunger does for food, telling you, specifically, that what you're currently doing, or pointedly not doing, isn't satisfying your attention's genuine need for engagement, and that it's time to actually change something about the situation, rather than simply endure it until it passes. Next time boredom shows up, try treating the first few seconds of it as genuine information, rather than an emergency that needs to be instantly extinguished with the nearest available screen. Ask, briefly and honestly, what your attention is actually asking for in that specific moment. A harder task, a different kind of task entirely, real human contact, or simply rest you've been putting off. The automatic reflex to grab your phone answers the discomfort quickly, almost immediately, but it rarely answers the actual question boredom was asking underneath it. Answering the real question tends to work considerably better and lasts considerably longer. People chose the shock over simply sitting still with their own thoughts. Not because they secretly enjoy pain, because their attention was asking for something, loudly and persistently, and absolutely nothing in that empty room was answering it. Once you see it, you'll notice it everywhere.